The fireplace crackled, sending amber sparks dancing upward into the old stone chimney. Outside, winter winds moaned through the trees surrounding the remote lakeside cabin, their brittle branches scraping against frost-covered windows like skeletal fingers. 3 pairs of young eyes gazed up at the weathered face of their grandfather, his features carved deep by time and illuminated by the dancing flames. "Grandpa Walter, you promised us a story tonight," whispered Ellie, the youngest at 8 years old, clutching her stuffed rabbit tighter to her chest. "Not just any story," added 12-year-old James, leaning forward eagerly from his position on the hearth rug. "You promised us the truth about what happened in Blackwood Hollow." Walter Harmon's gnarled hands tightened around the armrests of his chair. His gaze drifted past his grandchildren to the darkened window, where his own reflection stared back, ghostly and translucent against the night. In the glass, for just a moment, he thought he saw another face superimposed over his own. Younger, wilder, afraid. "Mom says we're too young," piped up 10-year-old Mia, though her eyes sparkled with anticipation. "She says it might give us nightmares." Walter smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Your mother's right to be concerned," he said softly. "Some stories leave marks on you. Once heard, they can't be unheard. Once known, they can't be unknown." "But we want to know," insisted James. "We're not babies anymore." Walter looked at each of them in turn, measuring their readiness. The wind howled louder outside, as if in warning. "Very well," he finally said, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. "But remember, this isn't a made-up tale. What I'm about to tell you happened 47 years ago, when I was just a bit older than you, James." He leaned forward, the firelight casting deep shadows across his face. "It began in the summer of 1978, in a place that no longer appears on any map. A place called Blackwood Hollow." The grandfather paused, looking toward the window once more. This time, all 3 children followed his gaze, seeing nothing but darkness beyond the glass. "This is the story of how I came to see what lurks in the spaces between worlds," Walter continued, his voice steady but distant, as if already traveling back through decades of buried memory. "And why, to this day, I never, ever go outside after dark without a light." The fire popped loudly, causing Ellie to jump. Walter reached over to pat her hand reassuringly, though his eyes remained haunted. "Now," he said, settling back in his chair, "listen carefully, and remember, some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again." Summer, 1978. The kind of summer that stretches endlessly before a young person, promising adventure and freedom. I was 17 that year, caught in that strange in-between time, no longer truly a child, not yet really an adult. Your great-grandparents had sent me to spend 2 months with my Uncle Philip in rural Vermont. To build character, they said, though we all knew it was really punishment for the trouble I'd gotten into during my junior year of high school. Uncle Philip's house sat at the edge of a small town called Millfield, though his property actually extended into the neighboring township known as Blackwood Hollow. The locals never spoke much about Blackwood. When they did, their voices would lower and their eyes would drift away, as if the very name called something unwelcome to attention. "Blackwood Hollow is dying," Uncle Philip told me the day I arrived, as we stood on his back porch looking out over the miles of dense forest that stretched behind his property. 20 years ago it was a proper town. Now there's just a handful of stubborn families, the old church, and too many abandoned buildings. "What happened?" I asked, squinting into the distance, where I could just make out what looked like a church steeple poking above the tree. Uncle Philip's face darkened. "Progress, some say. The mill closed, the young people left, the usual story." but something in his tone suggested there was more, much more, that he wasn't telling me. Uncle Philip was my mother's brother, a bachelor in his early 50s who'd spent his life teaching history at the local high school. A quiet man with a scholarly air, he lived alone in the sprawling Victorian house that had belonged to our family for generations. The place was a labyrinth of narrow hallways, creaking stairs, and rooms stuffed with books and artifacts from his travels. That first week passed slowly. Uncle Philip assigned me chores, splitting firewood, painting the garden fence, helping catalog his extensive library. The work was monotonous but not unbearable. At night we would sit in his study, reading in companionable silence while old jazz records played quietly in the background. It was during one of those evenings that I first asked about the photograph. It sat on his desk in a silver frame, yellowed with age. 5 young people stood in front of a strange stone structure that resembled a small tower or wide well. They were smiling in that carefree way of the young, arms thrown around each other's shoulders. I recognized Uncle Philip immediately, though he couldn't have been more than 20 in the image. "Who are they?" I asked, picking up the frame for a closer look. Uncle Philip's hand shot out with surprising speed, taking the photograph from me and returning it to its place. "Old friends," he said curtly. "What's that stone thing behind you?" "The Keeper's Well. It's in Blackwood Hollow." "Keeper of what?" He didn't answer immediately, instead rising to change the record that had begun to skip. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "It's just a local landmark, an old folly built by the original settlers, nothing important." But I could tell from the tightness around his eyes that he was lying. 3 days later, bored with my chores and restless for adventure, I decided to explore beyond the boundaries of Uncle Philip's property. He had left early that morning for a faculty meeting at the school, telling me he wouldn't be back until evening. With the whole day stretching before me, I packed a sandwich, a canteen of water, and a flashlight into my backpack, and set off toward the church steeple I'd spotted on my first day. The woods behind Uncle Philip's house were older and denser than any forest I'd ever seen. Massive oaks and maples formed a cathedral-like canopy overhead, with shafts of sunlight breaking through in dusty beams. The undergrowth was sparse in this deep shade, making walking easy, though there was no clear path to follow. I'd been hiking for maybe an hour when the trees began to thin, and I found myself at the edge of what had once been a road. Cracked asphalt peeked through carpets of moss and creeping vines. Following this neglected thoroughfare, I soon came upon the remains of Blackwood Hollow. Time seemed to have stopped here, children. The buildings stood as if their inhabitants had simply walked away one day, leaving everything behind. Storefronts with faded signs, a gas station with an ancient pump, a small schoolhouse with broken windows, and dominating it all, standing on a low hill, was the church I'd seen from a distance. Unlike the other buildings, the church appeared maintained, its white paint freshly applied, its small cemetery neatly kept. As I approached, I noticed a figure moving among the gravestones, an old woman in a dark dress, laying flowers on a marker. She looked up at my approach, her face registering surprise, then something like fear. "You shouldn't be here," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. I raised a hand in what I hoped was a reassuring wave. "Sorry, I'm staying with my uncle, Philip Harmon. I was just exploring." The mention of Uncle Philip's name seemed to ease her tension somewhat. She studied me with sharp blue eyes set in a face lined with age. "Harmon's nephew, are you?" She beckoned me closer. "Come here, boy. Let me look at you." I approached cautiously, stopping at the low stone wall that surrounded the cemetery. "I'm Walter," I offered. "Edith Caldwell," she replied. Then, after studying my face for an uncomfortably long moment, You have the look of your grandmother about you. You have the look of your grandmother about you. You knew my grandmother? Everyone knew everyone in Blackwood Hollow, once upon a time. She gestured at the graves around her. Now, I'm almost the only one left who remembers. What happened here? I asked, echoing my earlier question to Uncle Philip. Why did everyone leave? Edith's gaze drifted to a larger monument at the center of the cemetery, an obelisk carved with names, at least 20 of them. 1958, she said quietly. The summer of the disappearances. A chill ran through me, despite the warm day. Disappearances? 23 people vanished over the course of 3 months. Men, women, children. Her voice caught on the last word. They were never found. Afterward, most folks couldn't bear to stay. Can't blame them. I stared at the monument, reading the names. Many shared the same surnames. Entire families. Lost. What do you think happened to them? I asked. Edith's eyes snapped back to mine, suddenly sharp. It's not about what I think, boy. It's about what I know. She lowered her voice. Has your uncle told you about the Keeper's Well? The same structure from the photograph. The strange stone tower. He mentioned it, I said carefully. Called it a folly built by settlers. Edith made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a snort. A folly? Is that what Philip calls it now? She shook her head. That folly was ancient when the first white settlers arrived here. The native people avoided this entire valley because of it. My skepticism must have shown on my face, because she continued more forcefully. The well wasn't built to keep water in, Walter. It was built to keep something else out. Before I could ask what she meant, the church door opened, and an elderly man in clerical attire appeared. Edith, who are you talking to? His voice was frail, but carried an edge of authority. Harmon's nephew, she called back, then turned to me and whispered urgently, Don't go looking for the well, boy. Whatever your uncle has told you, whatever you might think, stay away from it. With that cryptic warning, she gathered her things and walked toward the church, leaving me standing alone among the graves, staring at the monument to 23 vanished souls. I didn't have long to ponder her words. Dark clouds had begun gathering overhead, and a distant rumble of thunder warned of an approaching storm. Not wanting to be caught in the woods during a downpour, I reluctantly turned back, my mind buzzing with questions about the Keeper's Well and the disappearances of 1958. By the time I reached Uncle Philip's house, fat raindrops were already beginning to fall. I slipped in through the back door, hoping to change out of my muddy shoes before he noticed. But as I entered the kitchen, I found him sitting at the table, staring at a map spread out before him. He looked up, his expression darkening when he saw the leaves in my hair and the dirt on my jeans. You went to Blackwood Hollow, he said. Not a question. I nodded, seeing no point in lying. After I specifically told you the property boundaries, you never actually said I couldn't go beyond them, I pointed out. Uncle Philip sighed, rubbing his temples. Did you speak to anyone there? An old woman. Edith Caldwell. Something like alarm flashed across his features. What did she tell you? About the disappearances in 1958, I replied, watching his reaction carefully. And she mentioned the Keeper's Well, the same one from your photograph? Uncle Philip stood abruptly, folding the map with jerky movements. He has never been right in the head, not since she lost her sister back then. You do well to ignore her ramblings. Were you there? I pressed. During the disappearances? I was away at college, he said shortly. Now, I don't want you going back to Blackwood Hollow. Is that clear? This time I am explicitly telling you, stay on my property. His tone left no room for argument, but his evasiveness only fueled my curiosity. That night, after Uncle Philip had gone to bed, I crept down to his study and began searching for information about Blackwood Hollow and the mysterious well. In a locked drawer, which yielded easily to a paperclip, a trick I'd perfected on my parents' liquor cabinet, I found a leather-bound journal. Inside were newspaper clippings about the disappearances, along with handwritten notes in what I recognized as my uncle's precise script. One photograph made my blood run cold. The same stone structure from Uncle Philip's silver-framed photo, but taken at night. A dark figure stood beside it, just a silhouette, blurry and indistinct, but unmistakably not human in its proportions. Scrawled beneath in Uncle Philip's handwriting were the words, "It's coming through." I was so absorbed in the journal that I didn't hear the study door open. Only when Uncle Philip's shadow fell across the pages did I realize I'd been discovered. He didn't yell. Somehow, that was worse. He simply took the journal from my hands, returned it to the drawer, and locked it with a small key he wore around his neck. "Go to bed, Walter," he said, his voice eerily calm. "And understand this, there are some doors that should never be opened. Some questions better left unanswered. People disappeared," I argued. 23 of them. Don't you think their families deserve to know what happened? A strange expression crossed his face. Grief, guilt, and something else I couldn't name. Their families know exactly what happened, he said softly. That's why they left. With those enigmatic words, he ushered me out of the study and locked the door behind us. I lay awake most of that night, rain lashing against my window, thunder shaking the old house to its foundations. In brief flashes of lightning, the shadows in my room seemed to move of their own accord, stretching and contracting in ways that defied explanation. And somewhere in those midnight hours, as the storm raged overhead, I made a decision. I would find the Keeper's Well. I would discover what secret had emptied a town and haunted my uncle for 20 years. I didn't realize then, children, that some mysteries are better left unsolved. That some knowledge comes at a terrible price. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had never happened. But something had changed in Uncle Philip. Over breakfast, he announced that he would be taking me with him to the school that day. "I need to prepare my classroom for the fall semester," he explained. "You can help me organize the history department's archive room." It was a transparent attempt to keep me under supervision, but I didn't protest. I needed time to formulate a plan, and the school might hold its own clues about Blackwood Hollow's mysterious past. The local high school was a low, sprawling building constructed in the 1960s, all concrete and glass, with none of the charm of Uncle Philip's Victorian home. As we walked the empty corridors, our footsteps echoing off metal lockers, I noticed how the building seemed to press down upon us, as if the very architecture resented our presence during summer break. Uncle Philip's classroom was neat and orderly, with maps covering one wall and glass-fronted bookcases lining another. While he busied himself with paperwork, I was directed to the small archive room next door, with instructions to sort and catalog a pile of documents related to local history. It was the perfect opportunity. Among the dusty files and faded photographs, I found more information about Blackwood Hollow than I could have hoped for. Yearbooks showing the same faces from Uncle Philip's photograph, town records documenting the gradual exodus after the disappearances, and most intriguingly, a folder labeled simply "The Keeper," containing what appeared to be local folklore and legends. According to these accounts, the Keeper's well predated European settlement by centuries. The indigenous peoples of the region believed it to be a doorway between worlds, guarded by an entity they called the One Who Waits Between. So the early settlers, dismissing these beliefs as pagan superstition, incorporated the strange stone structure into their own folklore, reimagining it as the prison of a malevolent spirit they called the Keeper. Both traditions agreed on one thing: the barrier between worlds grew thinnest during what the file called the Dark Time, a period occurring approximately every 20 years when certain celestial alignments weakened the boundaries of reality. A chill ran through me as I checked the dates. 1958 had been such a dark time, and if the pattern held true. "Find anything interesting?" I jumped at Uncle Philip's voice. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Just local history," I said, trying to sound casual as I closed the folder. "Indeed." He glanced at his watch. "I've finished earlier than expected. We should head back." As we drove home, I noticed Uncle Philip taking a route that deliberately avoided any roads leading toward Blackwood Hollow. The tension in his jaw and his white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel told me everything I needed to know. He was afraid. My scholarly, rational uncle was terrified of something connected to that abandoned town and its ancient well. And that dark time the documents mentioned, if my calculations were correct, another one was fast approaching. In fact, if I interpreted the astronomical information correctly, it would begin tomorrow night. That night, I awoke to the sound of voices. At first, I thought Uncle Philip must have visitors, unlikely as that seemed at nearly 2 a.m. But as I became more fully conscious, I realized the voices weren't coming from downstairs or another room. They seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, a susurration of whispers, too faint to distinguish words, but unmistakably human in cadence. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The old house creaked and settled around me, but these sounds were something different. They ebbed and flowed, like conversation heard through water, occasionally rising in what sounded like urgent pleading before subsiding again to murmurs. My first instinct was to wake Uncle Philip, but something stopped me. A certainty that he already knew about these voices, that they were part of whatever secret he was keeping about Blackwood Hollow. Instead, I fumbled for the flashlight I kept by my bed and swept its beam around the room. The whispers seemed to retreat from the light, fading to near inaudibility. But when I clicked the flashlight off, they returned, louder now, and coming from the hallway outside my door. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I slipped out of bed and crept to the door, pressing my ear against the wood, humming. The barrier. Philip knows. The fragments became clearer, though still disjointed. I turned the knob slowly, wincing at the faint creak of hinges as I pulled the door open just enough to peer into the darkened hallway. Nothing. No one. Just the familiar corridor with its faded wallpaper and antique side table. And yet the voices continued, now seeming to move down the stairs toward the first floor. I followed, barefoot and silent, my flashlight held ready but unlit. The old steps complained softly beneath my weight, but the whispering voices covered these small betrayals. At the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. The voices had grown more distinct, and I could now make out what sounded like an argument coming from the direction of Uncle Philip's study. Has to be closed properly this time. Too late, it's already aware. The boy could be... That last fragment, spoken in what sounded like Uncle Philip's voice, sent a jolt through me. They were talking about me. Moving closer to the study door, I noticed a thin line of yellow light beneath it. Uncle Philip was awake then, but who was he talking to? I hadn't heard anyone arrive, and we were miles from the nearest neighbor. I leaned closer, straining to hear more clearly. We all agreed after last time, Philip. The well has to be sealed permanently. The voice was familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it, and risk trapping them forever. That was definitely Uncle Philip, his tone anguished. There might still be a way to bring them back. Started years deluding yourself. You're deluding yourself. They're gone, Philip. And if we don't act now, more will follow. A heavy silence fell. Then Uncle Philip spoke again, so quietly I almost missed it. It found him today. Edith saw the mark on him. Then we have even less time than I thought. Tomorrow night. I must have leaned too heavily against the door, because suddenly it swung inward, causing me to stumble into the study. I caught myself against a bookshelf, knocking several volumes to the floor with a thunderous crash in the quiet house. Uncle Philip stood by his desk, his face ashen in the lamplight. But he was alone, completely alone. "Walter!" he exclaimed. "What are you doing up at this hour?" I looked around wildly. "Who were you talking to?" "Talking to?" He frowned. "I was reading aloud, that's all. Sometimes it helps me think." But the book on his desk was closed, and I knew. I had heard another voice. I insisted. "You were arguing about the well. About me." Uncle Philip's expression changed, concern giving way to something harder. "You were dreaming, Walter. Go back to bed." I wasn't dreaming. I heard voices in the walls, and then I heard you down here talking to someone about sealing the well and how it found me today. My uncle crossed the room in 3 long strides, grasping my shoulders with surprising strength. His eyes, when they met mine, held a wild, desperate look I'd never seen before. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This house is old. It makes noises. Your imagination, combined with all the local ghost stories you've been reading about, created those voices. But no." His grip tightened. "There is no but, Walter. What you think you heard wasn't real. Now go back to bed and forget about Blackwood Hollow. Forget about the well. Forget about all of it." He was lying. I knew he was lying, but something in his demeanor, a fragility beneath the stern exterior, made me back down. "Okay," I said, feigning acceptance. "I'm sorry. You're right. It must have been a dream." Relief softened his features. He released my shoulders and stepped back. "Good. Now get some sleep. We have a busy day tomorrow." But as I climbed the stairs back to my room, the whispers returned, fainter now, but unmistakable. They followed me down the hallway, swirling around my head like invisible smoke. Just before I reached my door, a single voice broke through with crystal clarity. A young woman, her tone urgent and afraid. "Walter Harmon, don't let it mark you too." I froze, my hand on the doorknob. The voice had spoken directly in my ear, as if someone stood right beside me. But when I spun around, the hallway was empty. Sleep was impossible after that. I lay awake until dawn, listening to the whispers gradually fade as morning light began to filter through my curtains. My mind raced with questions. Who had Uncle Philip been talking to? What did they mean about me being marked? And most pressingly, what was happening tomorrow night? The answer to that last question, at least, I already suspected. If my calculations from the archive documents were correct, tomorrow night marked the beginning of another dark time, when the barrier between worlds grew thin at the Keeper's Well. When Uncle Philip called me down for breakfast, I went through the motions of normalcy, mumbling responses to his forced conversation, while my mind worked furiously on a plan. He announced that we would be driving into Burlington for the day to visit a university library where he needed to research something for his upcoming classes. I could stay here, I suggested. Finish my chores? No, he said firmly. I think some time away from the house would do us both good. Translation, he didn't trust me alone near Blackwood Hollow, especially not today. The trip to Burlington passed in strained silence. At the university library, Uncle Philip set me up at a table with some books on Vermont history, close enough to his own research station that he could keep an eye on me. I pretended to read while watching the clock, wondering how I could possibly get back to Blackwood Hollow by nightfall, when we were an hour's drive away. The opportunity came in the form of Uncle Philip's former student, now a university librarian, who approached our table around lunchtime to greet him enthusiastically. They fell into conversation about academic matters, and Uncle Philip, perhaps thinking I was safely occupied with my reading, allowed himself to be drawn deeper into the library stacks to examine some rare manuscript. I waited until they disappeared around a corner, then grabbed my backpack and slipped out of the building. With the cash I had saved from my summer job back home, I caught a Greyhound bus heading back in the direction of Millfield. By mid-afternoon, I was walking down the rural highway that would take me to Uncle Philip's house. The sun hung low in the sky by the time I reached the turnoff to his driveway, but I didn't head toward the house. Instead, I struck out across the fields behind the property, making directly for the woods that would lead me to Blackwood Hollow. The forest seemed different than it had the day before, quieter. The usual sounds of birds and small animals were absent, leaving only the soft whisper of leaves in the occasional breeze. As shadows lengthened, I clicked on my flashlight, though there was still enough daylight filtering through the canopy to see my way. I had studied Uncle Philip's maps carefully, and believed I could find a more direct route to the abandoned town than my previous meandering path. Sure enough, after about 30 minutes of brisk hiking, I emerged from the trees to find myself on the outskirts of Blackwood Hollow. In the fading light, the empty buildings took on a more ominous aspect. Windows gaped like hungry mouths. Shadows pooled in doorways like crouching figures. The church on the hill stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its steeple pointing accusingly at the heavens. I needed to find the Keeper's Well before full dark. From the photographs I'd seen, I knew it stood in a clearing somewhere on the far side of town. Picking my way through the abandoned streets, I kept my flashlight beam low, suddenly aware of how exposed I was in this empty place. As the last crimson streaks of sunset faded from the sky, I found myself at the edge of a meadow, and there, in the center, stood the ancient stone structure I had been seeking. The Keeper's Well wasn't what I had expected. From the photographs, I had imagined something like a traditional wishing well, or perhaps a small watchtower. The reality was far stranger. It stood about 15 feet high, a cylindrical structure of fitted stone with no visible mortar between the blocks. Its circumference was perhaps 20 feet around, but unlike a normal well, it had no opening on top. Instead, the stones curved inward to form a sealed dome. The only opening was a low, arched doorway at ground level, barely large enough for a person to crawl through on hands and knees. Most bizarre of all were the carvings that covered every surface of the structure. In the failing light, I could make out symbols unlike any alphabet I'd ever seen. Angular glyphs that seemed to shift and change if I looked at them too long. Between these symbols were carvings of figures, elongated, with too many limbs arranged in impossible poses. I approached slowly, my flashlight trained on the dark entrance. A cool breeze seemed to emanate from the opening, carrying a musty scent like aged paper, and something else, something metallic and unpleasant. "I wondered if you'd come." The voice nearly stopped my heart. I whirled around, flashlight beam cutting wildly through the gathering darkness, until it illuminated the figure of Edith Caldwell, standing at the edge of the clearing. "Mrs. Caldwell," I gasped, struggling to calm my racing pulse. "You scared me half to death." "Better half than whole," she replied cryptically, moving toward me with surprising grace for her age. As she drew closer, I could see she carried something in her hands, a cloth bundle that clinked softly with her movement. "How did you know I'd be here?" I asked. "The well has been waiting for you," she said simply. "Ever since you arrived in Millfield, it's been calling you. Haven't you felt it? Haven't you heard the whispers?" A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the evening air. "The voices in the walls," I murmured. "That was the well?" "Not the well itself," Edith corrected. "Those caught between, the ones who weren't fully taken in 58. My mouth went dry. "The people who disappeared?" Edith nodded grimly. "Some of them, at least. Trapped between worlds." She glanced at the stone structure, her expression hardening. "The Keeper holds them there." "What is the Keeper?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Not what. Who? Edith unwrapped her bundle, revealing an assortment of items. A tarnished silver mirror, a small pouch of what looked like herbs, an old compass, and a knife with an intricately carved bone handle. "The Keeper was once human," she continued, arranging the items on a flat stone near the well. "A settler named Ezekiel Black, one of the founders of Blackwood Hollow. He discovered the well in 1786, though discovered isn't quite right. The well called to him, just as it called to you." She glanced up, studying my face. "You have the sight, Walter Harmon, just like your grandmother did, just like I do. The ability to see beyond the veil between worlds." "I don't understand," I said, though part of me feared I was beginning to. He sacrificed his life to find well, to look into the spaces between worlds. But looking wasn't enough for him. He wanted to cross over, to bring something back. Knowledge, power, who knows? The stories don't agree on his motives. What they do agree on is that he succeeded, partly. He opened the door. Edith's voice dropped to a whisper. But what came through wasn't what he expected. It possessed him, transformed him. He became the Keeper, neither fully human nor fully other. Trapped between realities, just as the well is trapped between worlds. She picked up the silver mirror, angling it to catch the last rays of daylight. The original settlers managed to bind him to the well using old magic they'd brought from Europe. He reproduced the ebon. The well continued to vanish. Only the fact that he'd succeeded, partly, meant that he became the Fateless. The original settlers managed to bind him to the well using old magic they'd brought from Europe. Magic they barely understood. The binding wasn't perfect, but it held, mostly. Every 20 years, when the stars align just so, the barrier weakens. The keeper can reach out, call to those with the sight, try to lure them to the well. Like in 1958, I said, pieces falling into place. The disappearances. Edith nodded. The binding was weakening. A group of young people, including your uncle and me, became fascinated with the well. We thought we could strengthen the binding, keep the keeper contained. We were arrogant and ignorant, and her voice broke. We failed. The keeper broke free, at least partially. 23 people vanished before we managed to restore the binding. I thought of the photograph in Uncle Philip's study, the blurry, inhuman figure. What happened to them, the people who disappeared? Some were taken entirely into the keeper's realm. Others, she gestured vaguely at the air around us. Others were caught in between, like echoes. You've heard them, haven't you? The whispers. The sun had fully set now, and darkness enveloped the clearing. My flashlight beam seemed feeble against the growing shadows. In the distance, I heard the rumble of an approaching vehicle. "That'll be your uncle?" Edith said, gathering her items hastily. "He'll be furious that you're here." "Why did you come tonight?" I asked, suddenly suspicious. "Were you planning to try the binding again?" A sad smile crossed her lined face. "No, child. I came to warn you. The keeper has marked you already. I can see it in your aura, a shadow that doesn't belong. It will try to use you to break free completely this time. How do I stop it?" Fear clutched at my throat. "You don't." Edith pressed the bone-handled knife into my palm. "The binding can only be renewed from inside the well. Someone has to enter and speak the words of binding from within." The sound of the vehicle grew louder, headlights now visible through the trees at the edge of the clearing. "Edith," Uncle Philip's voice carried clearly in the still night air. "Get away from him." She gripped my arm with surprising strength. "Your uncle knows the words of binding. Make him tell you. It's our only chance." Before I could respond, headlights swept across the clearing as Uncle Philip's station wagon skidded to a halt at the meadow's edge. He leapt out, running toward us with a wild look on his face. "Walter, step away from the well," he shouted. But something strange,